Good morning. I tell you what, I am a fan of this kind of day, the weather outside, all the refreshment from the rain, but also I know it's not, growing up, we kind of glossed over Halloween in the church, or we always talk negatively about it, but I've always been a fan of Halloween. I've always enjoyed, I'm an extrovert. I enjoy knocking on people's doors and asking for candy. Give me a day, give me a month of that, man, and I'll be fat and happy, literally, both with that. But I've always enjoyed this, and when we moved here, we found out what cool neighborhood we live in, that we'll have 200, 300 trick-or-treaters come to our house, and we've made that more of a thing, and I'm like, you know what? This is something to be redeemed. And so I look forward to Halloween every year because we put out a fire pit on our front yard and we invite people to come have hot chocolate, to stick around a little bit. And we've gotten to know neighbors and not so neighbors that live out of the way that have come back and said, "You're the hot chocolate house. You used to do s'mores." Yeah, we did s'mores until we thought about Halloween costumes. Like, that's a bad idea. Let's stay away from s'mores. But it's such a joy, and I love the time around a fire pit. Whether it's Halloween or anything like that, there's something about a fire pit that's just enjoyable to me. We go camping a lot, and I enjoy the fire pit. There's something that draws people. It's warmth, it's light, but some of the best conversations I've ever had, I think, would be around a fire pit. Fire is an impressive thing, and it's a wonderful thing, but at the same time, it can be very destructive. This is why you have, Smokey the Bear will have all these things to remind us how to manage fire. Because whenever fire is unmanaged, it's destructive, and it's scary, and it's frightening. But see, we all need to learn how to handle fire, especially when in Babylon. Because when in Babylon, we're going to be under fire quite often. So this week we are continuing our series called Against the Flow, looking at the life of Daniel and the story that is told in the book of Daniel. And today we're going to see three young men, three of his counterparts, that faced the fire and lived to tell about it. There's so many things of this story, especially Daniel, the early chapters in Daniel, that just keep on impressing upon me that I really need to lean into faith more than I have. That I really need to worry less about the things of this world, the things that I might be afraid of, the things that I might be stressing about. I need to worry less about those because God is bigger than all of them. And God will carry us through it. God will see us through it. So before we enter into Daniel chapter 3, I want to remind you what happened in the end of chapter 2. So King Nebuchadnezzar ended chapter 2 with a praising of Daniel, bowing down before Daniel because he interpreted the dream. So he bowed down before Daniel, but not Daniel's God. And that's important as we start, for us to remember as we start chapter 3. Chapter 3 says this: King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. It was 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. And it's set up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. I like using translations that call it a cubit because that just sounds fun. But really, this is this is going to be about 90 feet tall, is how we would understand that. So it would be out of this building if it were sitting here on the stage. It's a pretty impressive statue. It's definitely something, in that time, there weren't too many really tall things. And this is a statue that is set up in the plains that could be seen for a very long distance away. It's made of all gold. And so in the daylight, it's going to shimmer. You're going to be able to see it. It's going to be impressive. And King Nebuchadnezzar has it basically in his own likeness, this image of gold that is created for him. Now, remember in the previous chapter, Nebuchadnezzar gets this idea from somewhere. I believe he gets it from a dream that he had. In the interpretation of the dream, this statue started off as a gold head and then, changed materials as it went down to the feet. And he was told by Daniel that he is the head, he's the gold, but his empire won't last. And I'm convinced that Nebuchadnezzar, this is an effort of him saying, hold up, I'm going to change the story. I'm going to change how it's written. Instead of just the head being gold, the whole body's going to be gold. And this is to represent a kingdom that should last forever. I think Nebuchadnezzar is pushing back to the interpretation of the dream that he just received from Daniel chapter 2. He is setting up this gold image saying, my kingdom is going to last forever. He wants to have a kingdom where his will is the only will. And we're going to see how that plays out in this chapter. So he hires a top-notch praise band. He does. And he hires this band. He's not Church of Christ, so he can do this. He hires a band. He calls everyone to the plains of Dura. And at the command, whenever all the instruments are playing, this is also one of the accusations why you've heard this maybe, of why we don't have instruments in the Church of Christ, or at least some churches of Christ, is because Nebuchadnezzar. So if you've ever heard that connection, just follow along as we go here, because I think it's kind of funny with that. But he commanded that when the music starts, when you start hearing all the instruments, everyone should bow down and worship the statue. And to show how serious King Neb was about this, he says in verse 6, whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, if you're ever insecure about whether people are going to follow you, this is advice that you could follow. Like if you're just really concerned that people aren't going to follow your commands, you just threaten them to death. Threaten them with death. And this thing is, it's sad, but it's true how this works over and over in our world, doesn't it? And I would like to just point at other countries. Look at what Putin's doing, or look at what, this place is doing, that place is doing. But in all reality, I have seen this in our own beloved country as well, where some official will say, they won't say, you do this or I'll put you in the burning fire. What they'll say is, you do this or you're going to be ostracized, you're going to be cut off, your position is going to be yanked from you. You get in line or you'll be kicked out. And it's threat tactics. And it's no way to lead. Because you never know if people are actually following because they're afraid or if they truly want to follow. And there's a huge difference. And church leaders need to remember that difference as well. Because I've seen churches who will threaten, if you don't do this, then we will kick you out. We will excommunicate you. We will write letters to the other congregations saying why you should not be able to go to them either. We've used it as a firing squad, the threat tactics. And we are buying into a Nebuchadnezzar kind of leadership. And it's the wrong kind of leadership right here. See, there's this tension that is created whenever we're threatened with the blazing furnace. It's a tension that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Will the creature worship the Creator or the creation? Will the one whose God has put His image in worship something that was not made in the image of God? Will there be anarchy? Will there be a coup? Will there be the creation saying, God, we don't want to worship you anymore. We would rather worship anything else. It's a tension that goes over and over in our story and in our own lives, in our own personal lives, in our own collective history as humanity. It's this tension. Who are you going to worship? And Babylon says, it's cute for you to worship your God. But right now, I need you to worship our God. I need you to do that right now, and I'm going to force your hand with some fire. By the way, in the Bible, as I've said before, Babylon is any world empire. It stands for any world empire that goes against God. So let's be honest, there's a whole lot of Babylons today. There's a whole lot of empires that are encouraging us to switch teams, to run away from God and head toward the statue in the plain of Dura. The thing that you know, but we need to be reminded of, is faith is always under fire in Babylon. It seems like we're surprised whenever our own nation begins to make rules that are against Christ. Rules or legislation or even just suggestions that are not in line with Christ. And we're like, whoa, hold up, what happened? What happened is what happens all the time. People get in the way of God. People think that they are God, and so they make rules and regulations that will honor themselves or their own agendas rather than God. We should not be surprised when people who don't follow God don't follow God. Like, it should not be a surprise to us. This is how it works if they're not following God. What should actually be a surprise is when people who don't follow God actually do something good. We're like, hey, we can work with that. You may not honor God like I do, but we can at least use that. That's a good legislation. That's a good whatever. We should not be surprised when they don't follow God. Pressure will always be put on God's people as long as we live in Babylon. There will always be pressure. The fire, though, I believe the fire is Babylon is using this to threaten. But I think God uses the fire for His own purpose. God uses the fire for a purpose that we may not be fully aware of. Check out how Peter says it, 1 Peter 1, verse 6. You must endure many trials for a little while. Think you must endure the fiery furnace. These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold. You know how, you've probably heard how we get pure gold, right? Because it's not pure. Anyone who's played Minecraft knows that it's not pure. It's a little ore that it's a square block, and then you got to make it into this little nugget. And how you do that, you put it in the furnace. Minecraft is a wonderful teaching tool, by the way. That's really basically how it works. Is you melt the ore, and then you're able to scoop off all the impurities, and what's left is pure gold. How that works with faith is a lot the same. You want pure faith? It's tested through the fire. Peter says you are going to have your faith tested in Babylon. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You are going to have your faith tested as long as you live in Babylon. There's no way around it. But God has a purpose in this. In fact, God is testing your faith to see if it can be trusted, to see if it is pure. So Daniel's friends, they're about to have their faith tested. They're about to have their faith actually put on display because they're willing to stand in the line of fire. Let's check it out in verse 8. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. Verse 12, but there are some Jews from whom you set over the affairs of the province in Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Anti-Semitism is not a new thing. It's been around a while. People were hating on the Jews long before Hitler. And it may not simply be the Jews, but racism or any ism that might get in the way, that's what's happening here. There is no indication that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were out flaunting that they were different, that they weren't going to bow down to this statue. I kind of actually see the opposite. They weren't the ones saying, with the picket signs of saying, we will not bow down, or whatever. They're like in a little march around this whole plain with their causing a big old ruckus. I don't see that. Or God hates those who bow down to the statue. Like, we have no indication that that's what's happening. The reason they're called out is because they're different. We watched a movie last night, Hocus Pocus 2. Have any of y'all seen? You've seen the original Hocus Pocus, maybe? Hocus Pocus 2, we were watching that. There was a wonderful little line near the end of it about a guy who was picking on, kind of bullying the friend group, and he just didn't realize. He said, I thought I was making conversation by calling out your differences. And like it was that realization is like, oh, my favorite line in the whole movie was, I have to apologize to so many people. A lot of people just don't realize that when they're calling out differences, what they are doing is an ism. And what they're doing is making these lines in between and poking fun at and creating walls. So what happens here is the astrologers are saying, hey, there's a group of people that don't look like us, they don't worship like us, they don't walk like us, talk like us, or do anything else like us. We need to find a way to get rid of them. Oh, here's a great idea. This isn't the last time that this is going to happen in this book. This is going to be a repeated story. But they call out these 3 young men, presumably because they are doing their job so well that others are noticing. The king has made them over the province, in charge of the affairs of the province of Babylon. We read about that earlier. That's what happened in chapter 1. We know what was going on, and so does everyone else. And they're jealous. See, make no mistake, others are going to notice our faithfulness. And no matter how meek or gracious we might be in our faithfulness towards others, at some point Babylon's going to push back and say, I know you're a nice person and all, but you have got to do things this way. You have got to be more inclusive in this understanding. You have got to be more like the rest of the world. No, it doesn't matter how nice that you have been. Babylon at some point is going to push back because Babylon doesn't know any better. They don't know the way it should work because they just want you on their team. So Nebuchadnezzar brings them in, furious with rage. Nebuchadnezzar summons Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought in before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music," remember, it's top-notch praise band. Anytime you got a zither, man, it's on. Some of you are like, what in the world is a zither? Google it, all right? If you are ready to fall down and worship the image I've made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Gauntlet thrown, challenge accepted. But first, a question. Why did Nebuchadnezzar give these young men a second chance? Think about it for a second. We've already known Nebuchadnezzar to fly off the handle pretty quick. Chapter 1, he was ready to just kill all of them. Or chapter 2, sorry. Chapter 2, he was ready to kill all of them if they couldn't interpret the dream. Now he's willing to kill anybody that doesn't worship, and then he gives them a second chance. Why? The only reason that I can really come up with is that they were good at what they did, and Nebuchadnezzar knew it. They were so good at what they did that Nebuchadnezzar didn't want to lose them in the role that he had him appointed, because there was no one like them in all the kingdom. That's what we learned in chapter 1. So he gives them a second chance, saying maybe this was just some misunderstanding. Maybe it's something that they need to know how serious I am. I don't know what all was going on, but he gives them the second chance. And he basically challenges, throws the gauntlet down. If your God is worth worshiping, why was I allowed to beat you? That's basically what he's saying. What God can rescue you from my hand? He's like, I've already beaten your God. Whenever I brought you into exile, that's what happened. Why do you think your God can save you from my hand now? What do you do? What do you do when the pressure of the culture is so strong and you feel like your team is losing? What do you do when it feels like the church is dwindling And the culture just keeps on oppressing in. Don't think that this is just some ancient story. This is today. What do? When you look at it and say, the odds are stacked against us, Lord, can you show up? Can you do something? Because I'm barely hanging on. Make no mistake, this is a world that we're familiar with. The Babylon of our time is pressing in. And it's gone past requesting and encouraging us to switch teams. It hasn't made it to the point of the fiery furnace. But if trajectory is true, it might get there. I don't know. I take some great hope in what happens here in this story. But before we talk about their choice, let's consider that there's two different options of when Babylon is pressing in and we don't know what to do. There are two options for us to consider. One is bow along to get along. Bow along to get along. This is how some Christians deal with the fire. They water down their convictions. They hope by watering down their convictions, they kind of get the fire wet as well. So status quo kind of happens. That there's a kind of a calmness. I wouldn't call it peace, because it's not the peace that passes understanding. It's the peace that we have hoped for by not rocking the boat in the world that we live in. Just riding the wave, or as this whole series is talking about, going downstream, floating the river. Bow along to get along is how a lot of Christians rationalize their approach, and they do it in the name of prudence. Well, we'll live another day so that we can then correct it later. We'll push it down the road, kick the can down the road. You know, when these three young men were confronted by Nebuchadnezzar, they could have said, you know what, we will bow on the outside, but not the inside. We've had that kind of mentality, right? I will just bow on the outside, but my heart is not with you. We've even seen that in other biblical stories, where there will be some sort of playing on the outside, but my inside is not with this. That's one option. Or maybe what they could have done is said, you know what, we'll bow this one time, and then we'll go ask for forgiveness. How many of you have ever, don't raise your hands, but how many of you have ever considered that option, done that option? Because it's easier, we've convinced ourselves, it's easier to defy God than it is to defy our friends. At least once, just for a moment, because we can always go and ask God for forgiveness, and He's more forgiving than our friends are. If that's the case, find new friends, or at least convert your friends to Jesus. Because Jesus' friends shouldn't do that. I'm not saying we don't. We shouldn't. But we have this option of saying, you know what, I'll just bow along to get along. Interesting little tidbit that I found is Jeremiah 51:59 seems to indicate that Zedekiah, that's Judah's last king, is summoned to Babylon around this time. In fact, it may have been that he was summoned to Babylon to bow down to the statue. I wonder if the king of Judah bowed down, and I wonder what his rationale was. Just an interesting tidbit that Jeremiah gives us. But the truth is, too many Christians have opted for this option. The way many of these Christians choose to survive in Babylon is that they have more than one jersey in their closet. And whatever the situation demands for them to survive, they look at what team is winning, and they put on that jersey and say, hey, I'm with the winning team. You need to know about Jesus, right? And then, maybe they'll get to that point, but then they'll see another team winning, and they'll just switch jerseys. They're like chameleons, going anywhere that fits the world. And that's how a lot of Christians have survived Babylon. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because they muddy the water of the name of Christ for the rest of us. Here's the thing. Here's the thing that you might need to think on. The lukewarm never really get much heat. The lukewarm, no one really cares about. So maybe you need to ask yourself, if you haven't been under fire for your faith, maybe it's because you're too lukewarm and no one really cares. See, the reason people push back is because you're on fire. You're on fire, and people are like, whoa, hold up. We got to push back against that. The lukewarm, no one cares about. You're not hindering us. You're not stopping anything. In fact, you might actually come in our contingency vote that we have for some of the things because you just want to bow along to get along. The lukewarm don't cause waves. Those in the fire do. The option that the young men took was not to bow along to get along. The option that they took was stand for God and withstand the heat. Stand for God and withstand the heat. They decided to fight fire with faith. Not to fight fire with fire, although that's another way to understand it, but I'm afraid it could be misunderstood. They fought the fire with their faith. They were going to honor God no matter what, so check out what is said. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. I have to let you know that that is probably one of the most convicting things that I've read as of recent. I want to defend myself in so many ways. I want to defend God in so many ways. And it's come pressed upon my heart, God doesn't need me to defend Him. God needs me to follow Him. God needs me to highlight Him. He doesn't need my defense because He is God. He doesn't need defended. And I shouldn't have to worry about defending myself either as to justify why I'm doing what I'm doing. It says, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown in the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and He will deliver us from your majesty's hand. That's conviction. He will. But even if He does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Man, that's bold. They're talking to the ruler of the land face to face. Their boss, by the way, this is their direct boss. They're talking to him saying, look, we appreciate all that you've done for us. You know, putting us in charge of the provinces in Babylon. This is fantastic. You've honored us in so many ways, but we want you to know where the line is. We will work with you. We will work for you. But when you cross the line of asking us to worship anything other than the Lord our God, I'm sorry, you can take it all away. Because that's a line that we're not going to cross. We're not going to cross that line. But notice what they said. They knew God had power. He is able to deliver us. They believed it. How many times do we actually believe that God can deliver us through the fire that we're in? They believed it. But they also knew not just that God had power, they knew that God had a purpose. And they were humble enough to realize they may not know the purpose. Even though He is powerful enough to deliver us, He may not. Because it is up to God what happens with my own life. It is up to God what happens to me in Babylon. I may want to say, you know, God, if you spare me to live another day, then maybe we can win more souls. I might want that because it's selfish. I could live another day. God may be thinking, you know what? More souls can be gained in your death. Have you ever read about the judge called Samson? I don't like that story because the last bit of it says, and he killed more Philistines in his death than he did in the rest of his life. The book of Judges is not meant to be a war conquest in the understanding. It's meant to be a spiritual understanding, a spiritual conquest. And maybe God is saying, in my death, we're going to win more souls. I don't know His plan. I just know He has power. I hope for His plan in certain things. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, no. that God has power. They may not know His plan. They may not have been sure what God was doing. But make no mistake, they were sure of what they were not going to do. They were convinced. They had a faith that was fireproof. No fire could scare it out of them. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar had never had someone talk to him like that, and actually stand up like that before. In fact, this is evident that in the fact that right after this, he gets so furious that he says, put the fire 7 times hotter than it was. Now, I don't know where Nebuchadnezzar came up with that number, but I find it fascinating that he chose the number 7. A number that God has had His hand in from very creation. He created everything in 7 days. Like 7 is a huge number in Scripture, and Nebuchadnezzar is either just randomly picking a number or is being influenced by the God of all things. 7 times hotter. It's so hot that as the soldiers they bound the young men to throw them into the fire, as they get closer to put them in the fire, they themselves die from the heat. I mean, these are soldiers, not young men, and they die from the heat. But check out what happens next. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men we tied up and threw in the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like the Son of God's." It's fascinating to me that they were set free in the fire. They went into the fire bound, and while in the fire, they were unbound. You know, sometimes the things that are binding us, the answer is to walk through the fire rather than avoid the fire, because what happens is a lot of times when we avoid the fire, we stay bound. But when we go into the fire, when we put our faith to the test, the bounds that have been holding us back are no longer there. I find that fascinating, that in the fire, they are unbound, and even Nebuchadnezzar knows that. Now, how does he know that? Have you ever tried to look in a fire and see how things are going? It's kind of hard to see. You know, the only way that he would have known that they were unbound is if their arms and legs were up and they were praising God. I'm even going to say it. They were possibly dancing in the fire. I've heard a song about that, but we won't get there because that's probably not appropriate in this as well. The thing is, they were worshiping in the fire. They weren't worshiping from the music, they were worshiping with God. And I love this picture because they were unbound. They were free in the fire. But there's something more fascinating going on than their freedom. God was with them. They met God in the fire. They knew God before, but they met Him in the fire. They got to walk around with Him. I don't know how long they were in the fire, but as we come just a little bit, Nebuchadnezzar calls them out of the fire, and I wonder if they had a hesitation. I wonder if they were like, "Hold up, Neb, we're going to hang out with the Lord just a little bit longer. You know what? You can just sit and watch. We're going to hang out with God just for a little bit longer." I wish the story told us that. I kind of wonder how long they were able to just be in God's presence in the middle of the flame. Faith does not guarantee the absence of fire. In fact, it may be the opposite. But what it does for sure guarantee is the presence in the flames. That's what faith guarantees. Presence of God in the flames. There's a passage from Isaiah 43, verse 2 and 3. It says, "When you pass through the fire, I will be with you." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, "Praise God." Praise God. Notice how this affects King Nebuchadnezzar. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angel and rescued His servants. They trusted in Him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than to serve or worship any god except their own," capital G, God. Notice. Nebuchadnezzar saying that. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save this way. King Nebuchadnezzar is in awe of God, and rightfully so. Because whenever God's people endure the tests of fire that Babylon sends their way, Babylon can't help but notice. Cannot help but notice. See, King Nebuchadnezzar is in awe of God, and that's because fire does not get the last word. God gets the last word. Always. The God of heaven always gets the last word. But while we're in Babylon, Babylon has firepower. And the only way we can endure firepower is if we are fireproof. If we have a faith that is fireproof. And if we're willing to have a faith that is fireproof, that means it has to be tested by the fire. And when we endure the test, Babylon notices. In fact, I'm looking forward to next week as we see how well King Nebuchadnezzar noticed and what it meant for him and what it will mean for our neighbors and our community when we stand the test that they bring us. So I don't know what kind of fire that you are enduring right now. What kind of guilt, what kind of loss, what kind of sin, what kind of struggle, what kind of fire that you're dealing with right now. I just want to give you a quick word of encouragement. Hang in there. Hang in there. Because in the fire, when your faith is fireproof, the bounds that have been holding you back will be released. You will be set free, and God will be praised. So if you need some encouragement, if you need that fourth person in the fire with you, or just that second person, then I want to encourage you to take advantage of this invitation this morning. To come and find someone to say, look, I'm in the fire. Can you stand with me? Whoever that person may be. And if you're the person someone else comes to, I hope you're willing to join them for God's glory in the flame that will show off how amazing God is. If you need anything, would you let it be known as we stand and sing together?